In 1995, a small-town radio station signed off the air. But something else kept broadcasting. Now in 2025, the founder's daughter finds a tape that was never supposed to exist. What she uncovers isn't just a signal, it's an invitation. And someone, or something, is still listening. The days that followed were quieter, too quiet. Evelyn returned to her apartment in Camden to find her neighbors gone. Not just moved, vanished. The mail piled up, windows left open. Lights on timers still blinking in empty rooms. The silence wasn't peaceful anymore. It was waiting. She turned on the radio out of habit. All stations worked. Static was gone. The strange signal seemed dormant, but on 103.8 FM, nothing. Dead air. She should have felt relief. Instead, it felt like someone had held their breath and hadn't exhaled yet. Jared never made it back from the hospital. She called, emailed MESSAG, no reply. 3 days later, she received a padded envelope. No return address. Inside, a single Polaroid. It showed Jared standing in front of WCRN Studio B. But the building was gone. Behind him, only scorched earth. Like the station had never been there. Jared looked calm. But behind him, in the trees, there were shadows. Blurry, wrong, watching. She flipped the photo. A handwritten note on the back read, I went back to finish what we started. You were the key, but I'm the door. Evelyn tried to forget. She tried to move on. She donated the old equipment, deleted all copies of the reel, burned the journal pages, moved out of her apartment, and took a teaching job in upstate Vermont. She didn't talk about radio anymore, didn't own one, didn't listen to music with headphones, but silence didn't forget her. And one morning, on a crisp October day, her students gathered around her desk. Ms. Moore? One of them asked, Is this you? He handed her a dusty textbook he found in the back of the classroom. Inside the cover was a black and white photo. It showed Evelyn at age 5 standing in WCRN studio B. She never posed for that photo. She never visited that room as a child. Below the image, typed, Anchor point number 1, Evelyn Moore, acquired, October 11, 1991. She dropped the book, ran to the records office. WCRN, it turned out, had been broadcasting illegally for years. It never had a federal license. In fact, the building itself hadn't existed in public records since 1974. It had been condemned after a transmitter fire killed the station crew. Her father had never worked there. Not officially. So what had she been inside? What was WCRN? The deeper she looked, the less sense it made. Blueprints showed different layouts each decade. Interview records of former hosts contradicted each other. Some even claimed they'd never worked in radio at all. And the reel? The original copy was missing from the FCC archive. All records, scrubbed. All backups, gone. All but one, because Evelyn had copied it once, years ago, onto a private USB drive. She found it in her sock drawer, still labeled, Do Not Air. Final. She stared at it for hours. And then, she broke her own rule. She mailed it. To herself. At her old apartment, just to see what would happen. The package returned 2 days later, but it was no longer a USB. It was a cassette tape, labeled in handwriting that wasn't hers. Anchor point number 2, Welcome Home. That night, the lights dimmed. Her radio turned on by itself, and for the first time in months, the voice returned. Familiar. Warm. Double quotes. Good evening, listeners. Welcome back to The Signal. Tonight, we remember the ones who left the door open. Stay tuned. And then, beneath her floorboards, a faint knocking. 3 times. She didn't answer. She just sat still and listened. She thought she'd silenced it forever. But the signal was never about transmission. It was always about who's listening. Evelyn had stopped sleeping. Every night brought new sounds. A voice murmuring through her clock radio, even when it wasn't plugged in. Her cell phone ringing once at exactly 3:33 a.m., showing no number, no history. And once while brushing her teeth, she caught her reflection move out of sync for just a split second. She had entered the dead air window, the gap between perception and signal. A space her father had written about in one of his final journal entries. They don't enter through airwaves. They enter through silence. Silence is the bait. Noise is the invitation. Jared's descent was faster. He called her in the middle of the night from a hospital parking lot. I had a blackout, he whispered. I drove for 2 hours and woke up in a cornfield. My hands were covered in dirt. I think I dug something up. What? I don't know, but it wasn't alone. He started crying. I keep hearing the jingle from the sign-off. Evelyn froze out. The sign-off from WCRN hadn't aired since 1995. A short, unsettling jingle followed by a deep breath and the phrase, "Good night, listeners, sleep sweetly, we'll be watching." The reel had never been aired, but somehow the broadcast had begun again. Worse, it wasn't coming from WCRN anymore, that it was coming from people. Evelyn tested a theory. She played the real audio for less than 2 seconds on her phone, in airplane mode. Offline. Within a day, her neighbor knocked on her door and said, "Your dad had a nice voice." She'd never told him anything about her father. The next day, the same neighbor left town, didn't say goodbye, didn't leave a forwarding address. His house stood dark and quiet, but she could hear a faint hum when she walked past. They were spreading through the silence. Through memory. She turned to the only place left, her father's hidden safe in the basement, behind the furnace, sealed under concrete. She'd ignored it for years, but now it called to her. Inside, she found a small box of labeled microtapes and a note for Evelyn. "If you're hearing the broadcast, I'm sorry. I never meant to leave it open. But you must do what I couldn't. You must close the signal." The final tape was labeled only Anchor Point. She drove back to WCRN one last time. The signal was pulsing now, visible on equipment even when the station was disconnected from power. Her portable signal sniffer picked up the frequency from 2 miles out. The hum grew louder as she approached the station. Windows were fogged. Lights flickered inside despite no known source of power. And Studio B was glowing. The soundproof foam had started to peel, revealing strange carvings beneath, waveforms, or perhaps glyphs, etched directly into the concrete. The room was alive. And sitting in the center of the floor was her father, or something that looked like him. He wasn't breathing, wasn't moving, just frozen, as if paused in time. A faint radio static played from his mouth, which hung open like a broken speaker. Evelyn's legs trembled. She stepped toward him, microtape in hand. The room pulsed, the floor vibrated. And then the figure's eyes opened, blank, white, and flickering with signal. "Anchor Point," it said in her father's voice. "That's what you are." She dropped the tape into the desk deck, pressed play. It didn't play sound. It played light. Harsh strobe flooded the room. The walls screamed. Not with noise, but with pressure. Like gravity itself was collapsing. The signal screeched, then hissed. Then quieted. And the figure on the floor, her father, whispered, "Thank you." He slumped over. The signal went dark, for the first time in weeks. There was silence, but Evelyn wasn't sure if that was a win or the start of something worse, because when she stepped outside, the static was still in the trees. The wind carried a voice. "Good night, listener." The Federal Communications Commission archive in Chicago wasn't exactly top secret, but parts of it weren't meant to be accessed without cause, especially the cold storage vaults that held decommissioned materials from abandoned frequency experiments. Walter Moore's reel was filed under a label that simply read, "Subaural, File 19BWM, do not air." It took Jared weeks to pull the right strings. He had a friend, a former FCC tech who owed him a favor. A favor big enough to get them temporary access to Vault 6B. They flew out in early November. Evelyn barely spoke on the plane. Her mind kept replaying that voice in the studio, the masked thing that had spoken through a speaker, not with a mouth. She could still hear it in her sleep. Could still feel the pressurized atmosphere of that sealed room. Still smell the coppery scent that came before the humming started. They weren't hallucinations, they were bleed through, and she was running out of time. Before the signal bled through her. The vault was colder than she expected, lit with harsh white fluorescence. It looked like a morgue for media. Shelves upon shelves of analog formats, cassettes, reels, discs. Obsolete technology. Forgotten broadcasts. Dead voices. Her father's reel was on the top shelf of a locked cabinet. Inside, a black box, untouched since 1995. Jared loaded it into a portable reel-to-reel machine right there in the vault. Evelyn held her breath as the tape began to turn. For a long moment, there was only silence, then a strange warble like a siren underwater. And then her father's voice, distorted and tired. If anyone finds this, I hope it's you, Evie. You were always a good listener. But not everything that talks wants to be heard. We thought we could capture something, a voice from beyond. But it wasn't beyond. It was beneath, in the noise. Always in the noise. They found me after the first broadcast. Said I'd been chosen. I didn't understand then, but I do now. They can't come through without sound. They ride waves. They use us. Evelyn felt her knees weakening. This last broadcast. It's bait. If you play it, they'll know you're still listening. And if you broadcast it, they'll come again. The tape screeched violently, a high-pitched spike of sound that made Jared tear the headphones off. Then silence. Then a new voice. Not Walter. Not human. Just one word. Transmit. That night, Evelyn sat alone in her hotel room. The city outside buzzed and roared. Sirens, car horns, life. But in her room, it was too quiet. The reel tape was back in the box, locked, but she could feel it. Like static under her skin. Like radio pressure in her ears. She glanced at the TV. The screen flickered, then changed channels on its own. A snowy image appeared, a forest maybe. A silhouette standing between trees. Then a flash, and then her father's face. Distorted, crying, "Turn it off." She scrambled for the remote. Nothing worked. The screen froze on static. And then the voice. Again. Evia. Transmission open. 3:33. The hotel lamp burst. Darkness swallowed the room. She didn't sleep that night. Back in Camden. The station was no longer just a station. It felt like something alive. Studio B pulsed with low-frequency rumbling, even when unplugged. Jared brought in new shielding and frequency blockers, but they barely helped. Even turned off, the walls hummed. The floors vibrated. And then there were the listeners. People started reporting things. Emails. Phone calls. Voicemails left in the middle of the night. "Hi, I think your station's back on air. I heard a voice last night on 103.8. It sounded like a child whispering my name. Is this some new Halloween thing?" My daughter started humming something in her sleep, and it matched the melody I heard through my old ham radio. "You shouldn't be playing that sound. It's wrong." Evelyn hadn't aired anything, but the frequency had started without her. Jared called her one night, panicked. "Evie, I was listening to the reel again, just analyzing it. I didn't broadcast anything, I swear." "What happened?" He paused. "My dog started growling at the walls. The windows fogged up. Then, someone knocked." Evelyn felt her stomach drop. 3 times? Jared didn't answer. She knew. It was already too late. The frequency didn't need towers anymore. The listeners were the transmitters now, and the more people who heard it, the wider the door opened. The knock came again. 3 slow taps against the old wood of the classroom door. Jared froze. His laptop hummed softly on the desk, the waveform still glowing from the last playback. Evelyn held her breath. Knock, knock, knock. She stepped forward and opened the door. Empty hallway. No footsteps, no breeze. Just the stale scent of floor wax and old lockers. She stepped outside, scanning in both directions. Nothing when she turned back. Jared was still staring at the speaker. It said your name, Evelyn. I know, and it wasn't on the tape. That wasn't recorded. That was live. The classroom suddenly felt smaller, thicker, like the air had turned to syrup. Jared disconnected the speaker with shaking hands. This isn't just audio residue. It's active. Whatever your father opened back then, never closed. Evelyn whispered. Back at her house, Evelyn couldn't sleep. She kept the 3rd cassette in her coat pocket. It felt heavy, like it pulsed slightly against her thigh. At 3:30 a.m., she gave in and crept downstairs. The old stereo in the living room still worked. She placed the tape inside, but she didn't press play, not yet. Instead, she sat on the couch and stared at it. What had her father meant when he said, "They only need listeners"? She thought of Alice Redwell's trailer, the notebooks, the symbols scratched into the walls. She thought of the humming, of the hidden room, the child's voice, and then she noticed something she hadn't before. Faint scratches on the stereo's plastic casing, 3 parallel lines. Repeated again and again. She leaned in. They weren't random, they were tally marks. Someone had listened here before. The next day, Evelyn returned to WCRN. Alone. She hadn't told Jared. She couldn't explain why, maybe to protect him, or maybe because some part of her knew this wasn't his story to finish. The sun had just crested the horizon when she reached the station. Studio B was still unlocked. The foam-covered walls looked darker than before, like they were absorbing the light. She set the 3rd cassette on the chair. Then she sat and listened. This time, the tape didn't play any voices. Just a low frequency, so deep it made her chest ache. Then a sound like breathing, not hers. Then silence. And then a voice. Not her father's, older, broken, desperate. "If you're hearing this, I'm still alive, somewhere in the signal. They don't let you die, they loop you. I've heard my own voice saying things I never said. Evelyn, I didn't mean to let them in. I only wanted to hear what was out there." Her heart slammed in her chest. But the door doesn't swing just one way. Suddenly, everything in the room shifted. The hum began again, but this time it was louder, tangible. The floor felt like it was vibrating beneath her feet. And then the room changed. She was still sitting in the chair, but the walls were no longer foam. They were slick and wet-looking, like covered in condensation. The ceiling above her pulsed like a lung. And in the corner stood a figure. Small, human-shaped, face completely covered in a vintage radio. Mask. Where the mouth should be was a speaker grill. It tilted its head at her. Then it played. "You opened the signal again. He never left. You brought it back. You brought us back." Evelyn screamed and bolted from the room. She didn't look back. She didn't stop running until she reached her car, and when she slammed the door, panting and crying, she realized something else. The 3rd cassette was still in the room, and she hadn't pressed play. The tape had played itself. Later that night, Jared showed up at her house. He looked like he hadn't slept. "I ran more analysis," he said, stepping inside. "Evelyn, there's a pattern in the static." She didn't respond. He continued. "It's a call sign. Faint, but repeated every 2.8 seconds. Same one from your dad's final logs." Evelyn blinked. "I remember that call sign. WCRN didn't use it after 93. They changed to KRAX. "I know," Jared said. "But someone or something has been transmitting under WCRN's old call sign for years. Undetected. Because it's buried in the noise." She sat down slowly. "It's not a station," she said. "It's a trap." Jared's voice dropped to a whisper. "Then we need to figure out what's on the final tape." Evelyn turned to him. "There's a final tape?" He nodded grimly. "Your father didn't just record broadcasts. He kept something secret. A reel-to-reel marked "Do Not Air." It's still in the FCC archive vault in Chicago, filed under a defunct experimental frequency code, and with that, they knew what they had to do next. Evelyn had grown up around audio. The hum of her father's voice behind the microphone, the soundproof hiss of the studio door, the satisfying click of a cassette being slotted into place. Sound was part of her childhood, comforting, familiar. Now sound had turned against her. Ever since she opened Studio B, something had changed. Her ears rang at odd hours. At night, in the quiet, she would hear soft tapping, like someone knocking on wood from very far away. Sometimes it came from the walls. Sometimes the floorboards. She hadn't told Jared everything. About the cue. Writing, the handprint. The message from her father, and she hadn't told Nate anything at all. Because deep down, she wasn't just afraid of what might be coming. She was afraid it had already started. Jared called the next morning with urgency. In his voice, "I digitized both tapes," he said, "and I ran a crosswave comparison. There's a shared audio fingerprint." "What does that mean?" Evelyn asked. "It means both recordings were made in the same space. But one of them, the second tape, has audio artifacts that don't make sense. Sound that shouldn't exist." "Like what?" "Like voice shadows." Evelyn said nothing. Jared continued. "When we speak, we leave resonance, patterns. But they're speaking under the sound. It's not reverb. It's layered language. And it doesn't follow any natural waveform. Some of it plays backwards. Some in frequencies too low for the human ear." He paused. "Evelyn, this isn't just a broadcast. Your father was transmitting something that answered back." Later that day, Evelyn met Jared at his home, a cluttered single-story house filled with vintage audio gear, framed concert posters, and the smell of soldering metal. He had a waveform display pulled up on his laptop. "This," he said, pointing, "is the section that creeps me out most." He hit play. There was silence for several seconds. Then a faint voice. "Station open. Keep listening." 3:33. "That timestamp again," Evelyn said. "I saw it written inside Studio B." Jared nodded. "It shows up multiple times. And it's not a coincidence." He clicked open another file. A scan of the original WCRN broadcast log from October 17, 1995. One of the last entries from Walter Moore read, "Received unlisted frequency at 3:33. A .m, strong interference. Signal seems aware." Evelyn shivered. "What if the signal wasn't interference?" Jared asked. "What if it was contact?" They decided to go. There were rumors, long forgotten, that WCRN had been involved in more than music and midnight stories. That in the early 90s, a shadowy organization had offered money to rural stations in exchange for testing new audio equipment. Back then, stations were desperate to stay afloat. A few extra $1,000 to test experimental frequency channels didn't seem dangerous, but Evelyn had a hunch. She drove to the county library and requested access to the 1994 public meeting minutes for Camden Emergency Services. In one transcript, she found an odd entry: resident report of high-pitched noise from radio. Set at 3:30 a.m. claimed to see someone standing in her yard, speaking through her TV. Case closed. Unstable individual. The name? Alice Redwell. A name Evelyn recognized from childhood. A woman who'd lived just outside town in a trailer and was known to be strange. Her father had mentioned her once, said she called the station weekly to warn them to turn it off. Evelyn found Alice's old property listed under an abandoned address. She drove out that afternoon. The trailer was collapsed, overtaken by weeds and rust. But the interior was half intact. Inside, she found a stack of notebooks. On every page, written over and over, the same words. They don't need a transmitter anymore. They only need listeners. Underneath the mattress, she found something else. A third cassette. It wasn't labeled. But she recognized the handwriting, her father's. That night, Evelyn didn't go home. She and Jared met in the old AV room at the high school where she worked. They locked the doors, dimmed the lights, and played the third tape. It began with static, then the humming, then her father's voice. They're not what you think. They're not ghosts. They're not human. But they know how to sound like us. And once you hear them, they hear you. Then silence. And then a new voice, higher, cracked, almost like a child's, layered with other tones underneath. Evie, we've been waiting for you. Jared paused the tape. His face had gone pale. That wasn't recorded in 1995, he whispered. Evelyn blinked. What do you mean? I scanned the magnetic aging. That voice is recent. Like days old. But the cassette is 30 years old. Jared stood up slowly. Then someone's still using that frequency. Outside, the lights flickered. Inside, the old speaker on the table crackled. A burst of static. Then a soft knock at the classroom door. But no one had followed them in. Evelyn couldn't shake the feeling. That door, that voice, that humming child. And now, the chilling realization that Studio B wasn't supposed to exist. Not on paper, not in memory, not in any of the dozens of county documents she combed through. It was as if the station had grown an organ in secret, and it had sealed itself shut for 3 decades waiting. She hadn't mentioned anything to her husband, Nate. Not yet. He knew about her father, of course, the mystery of Walter. Moore had been part of Evelyn's story for as long as she could remember. But what she'd heard on that tape, what she'd felt inside the station, it wasn't grief. It was danger. Back at home, she couldn't stop herself from playing the cassette again. She listened with headphones this time. In the dark, the humming. Threat, but something else this time, slower, subtler. Faint sound buried behind the humming, like Morse code. She paused the tape. REWOUND. Again. Yes, it was unmistakable. 3 short beeps, 3 long. 3 short again. So as if the father had been trying to send a message. At 2:43 a.m., Evelyn picked up her phone and called an old friend, Jared Pike, a local radio tech who now worked as a freelance AV archivist. He was the kind of guy who still wore a wristwatch with a calculator and kept a drawer full of obsolete remotes. Jared, she said, her voice low, I need to decode something. Off a 1995 broadcast. There was a pause. Then, Evelyn Moore? Is this about your dad? She didn't answer directly. Can you meet me tomorrow? Where? WCRN. Bring everything. They met the next morning at the back lot, both bundled against the chill. Jared lugging a gear case full of converters, readers, and wires. This place looks worse than I imagined, he muttered as Evelyn guided him through the shattered rear. Window. Inside, the air was thick with mildew and silence. But Jared's eyes lit up like a kid in a candy shop. Analog gold mine, he whispered, touching a dusty reel. They don't make tape like this anymore. Evelyn handed him the cassette. There's something under the humming. I need to know what it is. Jared set up a portable deck and pushed play. As the tape rolled, his expression shifted. First curiosity, then confusion, and finally, fear. Okay, he said slowly. There's definitely more than one audio track here. It's layered, amateur, but intentional. He played a filtered version. Behind her father's opening voice, and the humming child was another voice. Very faint, almost like it had been placed there by accident. Find the second tape. Jared looked up. Did you hear that? Evelyn nodded. Her mouth felt dry. They worked in silence for an hour, isolating the layers, saving WAV files, and cleaning. Noise. Jared paused only once, frowning deeply. There's an anomaly in the sound signature. Between 0:48 and 0:51 seconds, it spikes unnaturally. That's not static, that's an interruption. Like a transmission? Like something was breaking in. As they were packing up, Evelyn noticed something odd under the old console in Studio A. A dislodged floor tile. She pried it up. Beneath was a shallow cavity, filled with dead spiders, broken cables, and a battered cassette case. It was blank. No label. No markings, but when Jared held it to the light, he pointed to something faintly scratched into the plastic. Return. To Studio B. They didn't sleep that night. The next day, Evelyn returned alone. She brought a crowbar and a flashlight. The lock on Studio B was old but solid. It took 30 minutes, 2 snap tools, and a desperate shove before the rusted latch gave way. The door creaked open. Inside, a room no bigger than a closet. Dark, soundproof foam covered the walls. A metal chair. A dead reel-to-reel recorder. And scribbled across every surface, walls, table, even the ceiling, were hundreds of lines in red ink. Don't listen at 3:33. They're not voices, they're doors. He's still down there. Evelyn backed out, heart racing. As she turned to leave, she saw something on the back of the door she hadn't noticed before. HANDPR, INT. Small, child-sized, burned into the wood like a brand, and just beneath it, in her father's handwriting, "Forgive me, Evier." She staggered out of the building, tears blurring her eyes. Whatever her father had been part of, whatever happened that night in '95, it wasn't just a radio experiment. It was something else. Something no one was supposed to survive, and someone, or something, had followed her home. On a dry afternoon in 2025, Evelyn Moore stood outside the decaying remains of WCRN 102.7 FM, a radio station that once hummed with music and midnight chatter. Now it was silent, doors padlocked, its signage sun-bleached and peeling, alone. Crow perched on the rusting antenna. Evelyn wasn't a stranger to this place. Her father, Walter Moore, had been the late-night DJ here in the early '90s. He'd called himself Walt After Dark, and people across the county would tune in to hear him tell ghost stories between jazz records and local news. But in the fall of 1995, everything changed. Walter disappeared. The official story was that he walked out one night and never came back. Some said he drove off a cliff. Others whispered about voices on the radio no one could explain. After a few months of strange calls and community pressure, WCRN was abruptly shut down. The tapes, they claimed, were destroyed. But Evelyn knew her father better than that. He wouldn't just leave. Not without a trace. And certainly not without saying goodbye. For years, Evelyn tried to forget. She went to college, moved to the city, became a school counselor. She told herself it was just one of life's tragedies. But in the back of her mind, WCRN remained a locked door she wasn't ready to open. Until last week. It started with a package. A plain manila envelope with no return address, postmarked from Camden County, the very place WCRN had stood silent all these years. Inside was a cassette tape. A Maxell 42, labeled in her father's handwriting. Broadcast, October 17, 1995. Do not air. Evelyn's hands trembled. There was no note. No explanation. She borrowed a tape player from the high school AV club and sat alone in her kitchen, heart pounding. The hiss of the tape filled the air, followed by the familiar deep voice of her father. Good evening, night owls. This is Walt After Dark. It's just past midnight, and what I'm about to play may not be for everyone. So if you're faint of heart, consider this your warning. Then the tape cut to silence, 5 seconds. 10, then a sound like whispering static and something else. Something that made Evelyn's breath catch in her throat. A child's voice. Not quite words, just humming. Then another voice. One Evelyn hadn't heard in 30 years. "You shouldn't have come back here, Walter." She yanked the tape from the player, palms clammy. Her father had never played anything like that on the air. Never spoken like that. And whoever that second voice was, it didn't belong to any co-host. That night, Evelyn couldn't sleep. The sound looped in her head, the child's humming. The whispered threat. What had her father uncovered? The next morning, she drove down to Camden County. The station was still there, barely standing. As she walked around the back, weeds crunching underfoot, she found a broken window and slipped inside. Dust danced in shafts of light. Tape boxes, water-damaged files, and shattered mugs littered the floor. Then she saw it. A door she didn't remember from childhood visits. Small, reinforced, tucked behind the old record shelf. Locked tight with a rusted hasp, painted on it in faint red letters. Studio B private access only. She hadn't known there was a Studio B back in the day. WCRN only used Studio A, the main booth, the recording room, and a tiny kitchen. But Studio B wasn't on any station map she could remember. And that door, it felt out of place. She took a photo, heart pounding, then backed out of the building and drove straight to the county records office. What she found there chilled her. According to the architectural blueprint dated 1991, Studio B didn't exist. It was never built. And yet, it was there, a locked door in a sealed abandoned radio station. What was her father doing the night of October 17th, 1995? And who was in Studio B with him? Evelyn knew she couldn't stop now. She didn't realize someone had followed her into the building.